When I look back on the last generation of consoles and the associated games that came out, many standout titles come to mind. In the AAA realm, we have gems like Red Dead 2, MGS5, Phantom Pain, Dishonored 2, Deus Ex Mankind Divided, Prey, Doom 2016, The Witcher 3, and a slew of other games, including one of my favorite franchises, the Far Cry franchise. I acknowledge not all the entries in that series were excellent titles, but at least in my opinion, 4 and 5 were very good. However, many of these games have been continuations of other franchises, with gameplay, lore, worlds, characters, and settings that we're becoming all too familiar with. I had a lot of fun with these games. They largely define the past generation of games for many and most gamers. However, for me, it's been the middle and indie markets which have given us the most truly unique experiences. Whether it be through gameplay, setting, story, or innovation and risk-taking, it has been the middle market that has truly defined the most original and memorable experiences for me during this past generation of gaming. Honorable mentions of middle market titles that have tried something new and original that have captivated me and stuck in my mind over the past several years include Kingdom Come Deliverance, probably for many of us one of the most prominent of the middle market titles, and I'd say probably one of the better games of the past generation. Ghost of a Tale, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, Observer and Layers of Fear, The Outer Wilds, the modern rendition of Frogware's Sherlock Holmes series, including Crimes and Punishments and The Devil's Daughter, more specifically. Styx, Master of Shadows, and the sequel, Styx, Shards of Darkness. Subnautica. What Remains of Edith Finch. Superhot. Vampire. The Sniper Elite franchise. The Talos Principle. Kona, Lost in Vivo, The Long Dark, Undertale, and Underworld Ascendant. However, the most recent, one of the most notable for me of these middle market games that I have played that left a lasting impression was Greedfall. One of the things that hooked me right away about Greedfall and ultimately motivated me to buy it was the aesthetic and setting. While most RPGs take place in the ironically typical quote-unquote setting for most fantasy RPGs, that being that pseudo-European world in the midst of its medieval period in history, populated with dwarves, elves, orcs, etc., in a universe where magic certainly exists and is practiced widely, a place that evokes the phrase sword and sorcery. Greedfall, by contrast, takes place in what would be, in terms of our history, the 17th and 18th century, a place of tricorn hats, knee-high boots, cutlasses, rapiers, colonial architecture, puffy shirts, and yes, guns. Additionally, the color palette, foliage, lighting, and overall look of the world bring to mind one predominant word, that being autumn. So it's also the perfect game to play when the weather turns colder, the food turns warmer, and the nights stretch longer. A game to cozy up to between Thanksgiving and Christmas and get you sunk into the mood of the season. Additionally, Greedfall, while emulating colonial age Europe, wisely has you setting out to this fantasy world's approximation of the New World, Tier 4D. Tier 4D is an interesting take on colonial North America, where the fantasy story and setting revolve around an untamed new frontier, countries and factions vying for territory, resources, and expansion, paganistic natives who are in tune to the ecology and nature of the world through oral tradition and magic, a world teeming with wildlife both familiar and strange, mundane and ferocious, and protected by towering and terrifying monsters. You play as the legate Desardet, emissary of the Congregation of Merchants, one of the several continental countries/factions, a neutral nation who seems to oversee the abundant trade between the other nations of the continental expanse, as well as the colonies of Tier 4D. After your mother is stricken with the devastating plague, the Malachor, that is ravaging the continent, she sends you, Legate Desardet, to the New World, where it is said that the strange creatures, people, and magic of the land hold many secrets as yet undiscovered by the continental nations. You're given the task of traveling to the New World to act as legate of your nation, to settle disputes between the colonies and factions, but above all else, to find a cure for the Malachor. Greedfall's story then revolves around the search for a cure to this terrible disease that will have you explore the vast island of Tier 4D, broker peace between the natives and the Continentals and among themselves, solve political disputes, and come to understand the power and magic of the island and unravel the mystery of its strange creatures and people. So, Greedfall's plot, as I said, you are sent as a sort of political emissary who's kind of outside the general bounds of politics and national identity, and even law to some extent. You're definitely an arbiter sent to settle disputes, but as I said, find a cure for this disease, the Malachor. There are 3 continental nations who've established colonies on the island of Tier 4D. The first being the Merchant Congregation, as I said, they act as sort of the economical arbiters between the 2 other warring factions, the colonies on Tier 4D and the natives themselves. In addition to the nation of the Congregation of Merchants, you have the nation of Ptolemy. Ptolemy is a magic-based society to some extent, but really their claim to fame is their fervorous adherence to this monotheistic religion. Even their clothing and their speech and their behavior are closer to puritanical Christendom in colonial era Europe, as well as elements of strong and heavy missionary corps of that time period and the Spanish Inquisition as well. They're a less than tolerant bunch and a little bit fanatical about their religion, their monotheistic religion. Much like in other fantasy stories, the god that they worship is not really an Abrahamic god or anything like that. It's a close approximation, but they worship the god of light, kind of like in Game of Thrones, or the sun to some extent. And it's a highly religious culture and civilization. But once again, through their faith, they tap into magic, and when you encounter them in the world or in combat, they're going to be largely mages. In addition to that, you get a party member from each of the major factions in the game. So you definitely get a priest from Ptolemy, who's primarily a mage, but he's definitely more world-weary and savvy, and understands sort of the nature of politics, so he has a lot more tolerance than some of his brethren. He's a lot more open to the natives and even the other nation, which is to be his enemy. And he's sort of an all-around good guy, and he has a bit of a sordid past as well, so he's definitely an interesting character. The architecture in Ptolemy mirrors that of 17th century Europe, perhaps London, or perhaps parts of France, like I said, with that sort of puritanical bent. Moving to the other side of the island, the opposite colony, and the enemy of Ptolemy, you have the Bridge Alliance. The Bridge Alliance, I think, is a conglomeration of nations that have banded together in the pursuit of science and in the pursuit of colonial expansion into Tier 4D. There's a heavy Middle Eastern vibe to a lot of the costumes and outfits and architecture of the Bridge Alliance's main colony. Much like the Middle East around the 16th and 17th centuries, they're heavily involved in science, especially alchemy or chemistry. So when you encounter fighters from this group, they will largely be using bombs, things of that nature, and also firearms. They're a society steeped in a strict adherence to the scientific method, and so they view a lot of magic and the beliefs of both the people of Thélème and the religious beliefs of the islanders as mere superstition, which is a little bit odd since it's quite clear that magic exists in the world, but I think they seek to explain it through more scientific methods. So they don't really take a lot of what the islanders believe or what the people of Thélème believe seriously, and it seems that their clash in philosophy and ideologies has led to this war with Thélème. It must be said, however, that there's no outright warfare on the continent of Tearford yet, but the two nations are at war. You will get a companion from the Bridge Alliance. She is a researcher who's been sent to Tearford to sort of catalog the interesting flora and fauna, and I think she's tangentially also working to discover a cure for the Malachor as well. Her combat style's much more akin to like a musketeer. She occasionally uses bombs, but more frequently uses a musket, and she's focused on range combat. The next faction is the Coin Guard. The Coin Guard is a guild of mercenaries who for some reason have been hired by almost every nation and government to guard and protect specific things like important shipments and stuff like that, all the way up to important government personnel, including rulers and delegates and stuff like that. So, as you would expect, it's sort of rife for corruption, and a lot of elements in the story and a lot of quests are going to be revolved around sort of rooting out the corruption in the Coin Guard. But essentially they're mercenaries, and most of their members, when you encounter them, are going to be heavily armored and carrying usually two-handed weapons. Your companion that you get from them has actually been your fencing and combat instructor since you were a young boy in Serene, which is the town you come from the merchant congregation. And yes, he typically uses heavy armor and a two-handed weapon as well. The last major faction, not including the natives to discuss, is the Nauts. The Nauts control all nautical shipping and travel, and all of the ships in general in the world of Greedfall. They have a secret sort of proprietary ownership of the ability to navigate across the seas that they won't share with anyone. People aren't sure if it's science, people aren't sure if it's magic, no one really knows how they do it, and it's a closely guarded secret. Because of this, they own all of the ships in the world, and they conduct all of the nautical travel, be that shipping or just conveyance of people to and from the continent to Tearford. So they're a very powerful group, because Tearford would not exist without the cooperation of the Nauts, and they seem largely apolitical as well. They try not to get embroiled in political disputes in order to be able to serve whatever nation they need to maximize profits. So they're a sailor guild, and you get a captain of a ship as part of your crew, and they're very good at one-handed sword combat, and they use a little bit of alchemy for things like poisoning blades and stuff like that. Oddly enough, I don't think they use guns, which is strange. The last faction that you'll encounter is, of course, the natives. Now, the natives can't just be called one faction necessarily, because they have individual tribes, and inside of those, or amongst those individual tribes, they do have conflicts with each other that will need to be resolved throughout the course of the game. You, again, get a companion member from one of the tribes, and she is predominantly adept at using one-handed weapons and also magic in the world. The natives have this sort of symbiotic relationship. There's a lot of dangerous animals and even monsters on the island of Tearford, but they have this sort of like communion with nature thing going on, kind of like the Na'vi from Avatar, or basically any, Native American metaphor throughout pop culture. So they're very in tune with the island and have a symbiotic relationship with a lot of its more dangerous creatures. And the island is a place of great magical power in the world of Greedfall. So they've tapped into that, and they're very adept at magic. So your companion uses equal parts magic and equal parts one-handed sword combat. So this game is very similar to like a Bioware game. And I'll get into a lot more of the similarities later, but basically it's a lot sort of like Mass Effect in the sense that you're given a primary objective, like in Mass Effect, to go track down, I think his name is Saren, and figure out, what was he the cause of the attack in the beginning and what is he up to. That's primarily what you're doing. But along the way you're going to get sidetracked and entangled in all sorts of political messes and squabbles. And so, though your primary objective is to find a cure for the Malachor, in order to accomplish this, you're going to have to win the trust of the natives, settle disputes between the two warring nations, deal with the interests and disputes of your own country, and try and broker peace between the natives, amongst themselves, but also amongst the warring factions. So, as you can imagine, it's going to be a game that's largely about what decisions you make when it comes to different people, who you decide to side with, who you decide to support, and paying attention to dialogue as well, learning things about people, learning things about not just what they believe, but also their specific personalities, so that you aren't caught off guard later, by their actions. And your decisions are going to heavily influence, obviously, how the politics of the region play out and how conflicts are resolved. So that's basically the world of Greedfall, at least the plot and many of the factions and characters. And it's, as I said before, it's a world that just really grabbed me. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't a good number of RPGs that take place in interesting settings, but typically what you see is the typical fantasy trope, and sometimes you'll see stuff in a futuristic setting, like sort of a cyberpunk type thing going on. And I'm sure there are plenty of games too that take place, around this time period, but it was just sort of a breath of fresh air to be playing a game that takes place in a sort of allegory for North America as the New World, and you play as a 17th century or 18th century colonial guy. I love the aesthetic and look of the game. The architecture in all the towns is really, really beautiful and impressive. And again, not something you see typically in an RPG or a fantasy game. In addition to that, I love the fashion in the game, the armor, the look of the clothes and everything. Again, something you don't see in a fantasy RPG. I love being able to hook a cape is a separate clothing item, for example. So you pick out however you want your character to look, and then you can add a cape on top of that. And you can pick, a tricorn hat, or, like a sort of Scarlet Pimpernel or Three Musketeers style hat with one side rolled up and a giant plume sticking out of it. There's just a lot of, you can make these sort of larger than life characters and larger than life outfits for your character that I just thought was really great. Again, you don't see it in a fantasy RPG. And so the whole thing was very refreshing. And of course, just the inclusion of guns. It's not just restricted to, mage combat or melee combat and maybe bow combat. It's like just, you can go out there with pistols and just start dropping dudes. And you can play as a musketeer class or something of that effect. So all of that was really refreshing. The world is, in terms of talking about the graphics and the beauty of the game, it has to be said that from a technical standpoint, it's not very impressive. It's not going to be, it doesn't have ray tracing or anything like that. Textures might look a little bit softer or muddier than some other, AAA competition. Character models may not be, have the best complexity or detail or geometry. But the thing that works for this game is the aesthetic is so well realized due to a large attention to detail. Every little place you go, every little thing you see has just so much detail crammed into it. When you go into a library and you see like each individual book rendered, and some of them are like strewn about the floor and their pages are open, and you know, the beautiful detail in the wood and the rugs, especially when you go out into the forests. You go into the forests and there's so many different types of floor foliage, you know, very, very short leaves and foliage, very, very, you know, medium length stuff, knee length stuff, tall stuff, tons of different types of looking trees, lots of detail in the ground texture to make everything look just... It adds this sense of depth and realism to the visuals of it, even though the graphics in and of themselves from a technical standpoint aren't super impressive. They did a lot with what they had to make it look amazing. And so it really is a breathtaking game visually because there is so much detail. I mean, when you go into the forests and you see, you know, you're in this green meadow and then you go into a forest and it's just this explosion of orange all over the floor, and then like I said, like different levels and different types and lots of detail of foliage on the ground, it really sells it as a real place. And then of course you'll come upon little bits where there's like little sort of damp patches of earth with, like, you know, the appropriate reflection from the water in the puddle. Particle effects of it seems like there's a constant stream of autumn colored leaves sort of falling down around you because of the particle effects. And also there's this giant volcano on the island that through many of the island's locations you can see, especially at night. If you go out at night, you can see it in the distance and see the magma running down it. You get these sweeping vistas and these beautiful views, and really interesting architecture of the geological formations, and also there's a lot of visual distinctness from one area to the next. There's many biomes in the game. They're all visually distinct, and each area feels like its own distinct place. And there's a lot of a unique look to the game, but it also it's also extremely reminiscent and harkens back to paintings of, you know, what we would associate with sort of like Thanksgiving scenes and stuff like that, which makes this a really great game to play in the fall, you know, around Thanksgiving, maybe going into Christmas time, because it really gets you in the mood of that season and the feeling, the colors of the leaves and everything. It's just a beautiful game to look at, and all the imagery just works together. And yeah, it looks like sort of colonial North America, and it feels like it, but there's enough distinct and unique things going on that it's not a one-for-one comparison. So it's an impression of a fantasy version of the New World, which is great. And I gotta say, the thing that is technically impressive in the game is the lighting. I remember going into one of the buildings and seeing the, you know, high dynamic range, you know, and playing with that, and, you know, areas that would get bright and then like super dark, and then your eyes would adjust and it would sort of brighten up, and the beautiful color of all the natural light in the game, from candelabras to lanterns, and then moving on into some of the best times to be walking around the forest or even walking around town in this game are just a little bit past dawn and then close to dusk when the sun sets, because the coloring of the lighting that they use is just beautiful. It's just perfect for that autumn fall feel with like deep reds and oranges in the lighting. And because the shadows have so much detail, and it's got this beautiful day-night cycle with the moving light source, everything just looks amazing all the time. And I like that the lighting is so distinct that you can go to the same place at different times of day and not even really recognize it, because the color palette becomes so different. But also the light, the way it interacts with trees and goes through leaves and goes through windows and casts shadows and casts color bits of light on buildings and stuff. It's just gorgeous, like really, really gorgeous. And I was thinking like, wow, they got Unreal 4 to run really well on the Xbox One. I put it on Xbox One, by the way, because my PC can't run it right now. So, I was like, wow, they got, you know, because like Outer Worlds used Unreal 4, and like nothing looked this good in that game, and nothing looked quite right, and like, you know, and it had performance issues here and there, and every other Unreal 4 game I've played on Xbox just runs like crap. And I found out later that, and this is a testament to Spiders, I can... You know, because Unreal, in my opinion, has some of the best lighting in the industry, and Spiders didn't use Unreal 4. They used their own in-house proprietary engine that they've made all their RPGs on. So I was like, I was blown away that they were able to get this much visual fidelity out of an engine that, as far as I know, they've been using since Mars Warlogs, or even earlier, Bound by Flame maybe. So they've really modified the engine a lot to look visually impressive even in this day and age, and they've really spent a lot of time making all the environments look very detailed. And especially the lighting is, it's on par with what Unreal 4 can output in a game. So, really kudos to them for making such a beautiful game. So the best way I can describe it, as I said, is it's not technically impressive, but there's a lot of artistry and detail and love that went into it, so it is visually impressive. And I gotta say too, most middle market titles on Xbox One, because Xbox One is sort of like the redheaded stepchild of the consoles, when a company has to make something for it, they just do a sloppy port of the PS4 version that they did, or the PC version, and then they don't try and optimize for the hardware. And so I can't tell you how many games I've played that should run well because they're not that graphically intense, especially when, I see what it has been able to put out with games like Far Cry 5 or Red Dead 2. It's like, yeah, the hardware's not as good as it should be, but it's still no slouch. If optimized properly, games can look and run great on the system, and they just don't, especially in the middle market, because they don't have the time or money to go back and properly optimize. So, for example, a game like Styx, Shards of Darkness, it's a good-looking game, don't get me wrong. It's just not visually complex enough to have to downscale the resolution as much as they do on the Xbox version, and have load times like they do, and have extreme frame rate and tearing issues. And I have to say, I was very, very impressed. Except for a couple areas where there was like a lot going on in the game, Greedfall runs really. They took the time to properly optimize it for the Xbox One, so it runs at like a good. I couldn't tell what the frame rate was, but it seemed a little higher than 30. I've got a good feel for 30 these days, because most games are locked to it on the console. So it was closer to like a 35-40 frames a second, and it was fairly solid throughout the entire playthrough. Additionally, I experienced personally no major bugs in the game, except for one crash, which could have been attributed to my Xbox, because I think I left it on for like 5 days in a row. And then I just picked up Greedfall again. I went through a door and it went like meh, and then it crashed, but it was fine, The game is pretty generous with autosaves, so it didn't cause me any trouble, but there was no massive quest bugs where like a quest wouldn't finish or wouldn't trigger or something. I didn't have any issues like that with the game. The soundtrack and score of the game are excellent too. They give you this real sense of sort of epic adventure and a yearning for exploration when you're in a lot of the cities. Also, the scores for each of the cities, I think, really match the character of the nation that runs the city or the colony, as well as just the feel of the city and the colony. And then, of course, there's these really great sort of ominous and mysterious tracks that evoke ancient or images of ancient ruins and culture and stuff like that when you're out in the sort of mystic wilds of Tier 4D. So I gotta give a shout out to the music as well. It's just a really great sounding game. I mean, the sound effects are pretty good. Nothing to write home about. I can't think of anything, really stand out about the sound in general, but the music is excellent, and I think all the voice acting, in my opinion, was really, really good. Although it has to be said, I found the natives' accent very weird. I think they wanted to draw parallels to Native Americans, but they didn't want to be called prejudice or bigots or insensitive or anything like that. So the natives have this weird amalgamation of Arabic, South African, Irish/Scottish at sometimes. Like, it's this really weird accent. And one of the weird things is how they got all the voice actors to be consistent. Every single voice actor that voices a native in the game, they have the same accent, but they're all different voice actors. So I don't know how because it's like they just arbitrarily came up with some rules, and the pronunciation is very, very weird. So I thought that was kind of...
I have no idea what you want with her, but no one in the village will tell Renaikse where to find her.
I do not seek to harm her, only to speak with her.
I don't know where she is. Her Voglendyke might know.
What does that mean? What are the two of you talking about?
3 woodcutters died after eating the meat of an andrig after it was killed by a venomous Dawson tat.
It's nothing but a terrible coincidence. And if they had eaten the ochre berries...
So yeah, in terms of the presentation of the game, that's what you can sort of expect. Now, moving into gameplay, as I said, this is going to be best compared to a sort of Bioware RPG. Story choice and dialogue are extremely important in this game, and so you're going to want to pay attention to what people say and how they say it and how they behave and what their actions are like and what's going on and the motivations of each faction and each character. And of course there's a faction system with where you have standing with them, and you can either improve it or decrease it depending on your decisions and actions in the game. And another way that it's like a Bioware game, I was actually a little bit misinformed on this, because these days I try to go into games sort of blind, and I didn't want to read too much on Greedfall because I really wanted to play it. So I popped it in, and I assumed that it was going to be, an open world RPG that like every other thing we've been playing for the past several years. But it is a lot more like a Bioware game in that it is a game that is sort of limited in traversal options. Like, you can climb stuff, but it's all going to be context-sensitive stuff that is also a skill check. So it's never going to be to get to extremely important areas, because if a player doesn't have those skills, then you don't want to completely lock them out of story-important stuff. So for, all intents and purposes, there is really no climbing, or there's no jump button in the game, for example. It's very, very similar to like Mass Effect, where, everything is sort of built with these sort of corridors, and corridors and walls, and, invisible walls and invisible corridors. And so there are a lot of sort of medium to large size, like, maps, and that's how the game is split up. So you can't just like walk from one city to the next. You walk to the edge of the map that you're on, and then you'll go to a travel screen, and then you will show up at the next map, which could be all the way across the island. So that's how it's split up, a bunch of mini sort of maps. And these maps also are not what you would consider open world, because it's like you can't just climb up a mountain. In fact, you can't even go through certain types of foliage and stuff, because that's the edge of the map. And so if you've played a Bioware game like Knights of the Old Republic, like Mass Effect, I think Dragon Age, it should be pretty familiar territory for you. But it was a little jarring for me at first, because I thought it was going to be like a traditional open world sandbox style RPG, and it's not. It's closer to that Bioware model. So yeah, the way in which you play the game is, yes, you go to the different maps, and then you're going to want to explore them. You can unlock campsites, and the campsites act as fast travel locations around the map itself. And then when you get to the edge of the map, then you can travel to a whole other area of the game, which is to say another sort of mini map. And you can also travel from your campsite as well. So you'll travel around these areas, and there will be a lot of context-sensitive exploration options. Like, for example, there's these like very narrow caves that you need a sneak ability, which is just increasing your intuition talent up to a level of 2, and then you can do them. Another talent you have is called Vigor, and this allows you to use those context-sensitive climbing actions, like I said, or jumping actions. So exploration is locked behind how much you've developed your character and what points you have dumped, what talents and skills you've dumped points into. And of course, within these maps, you'll discover different villages, different towns, and there you'll pick up quests. Although it has to be said that exploration is encouraged because there's always interesting loot to find and new areas to find. And then, of course, unlocking the campsites that allows you to traverse the world more easily. Well, what I found was that I felt that a lot of my runtime with the game was a little bit redundant, because when I would get to a new map, I would just explore the whole thing as soon as possible. But a lot of things would keep me locked out. Sometimes parts of the map are locked out because there's a story mission that's going to take you there. So there'll be like a landslide over the ravine you need to get through. And only after you get through a certain portion of the game will someone blow it up with dynamite or something, and then you can get through. In addition to that, yeah, as I said, a lot of the exploration is locked behind skill checks, and so if you're a low level, like you're just not going to have enough points dumped into any of these skills to be able to traverse the obstacles. And in addition to that, I can't think of a single area in the game that you're not required to go to through some sort of side quest. Now, if you just blast through the main quest, yeah, you're not going to see the entire world, and you're going to be missing a lot of content. But if you do all of the side quests, you will go to pretty much every single place in the world. So it's also not like an open world game. Like let's compare it to, say, Fallout New Vegas. You can do every main quest and every side quest and every faction quest in that game and still not find everything there is to find in that map, because there's so many little hidden nooks and crannies and things that are just kind of like fun little things to find as you explore that aren't necessarily part of a quest. But in this game, I found that, yeah, it was all part of a quest. So if you want to see the whole map, I would just keep playing quests, is what I would do. And if you're in an area for a quest, like a part of a map, and you want to look around for a treasure chest or whatever, do that. But I wouldn't just go out and explore for the sake of exploring, because you're going to be going, it's going to pad out your runtime probably a little too much, and it's going to be a bit redundant. When you're out exploring, so obviously you know that's sort of the Bioware emphasis on dialogue and characters and player choice and things like that. The other half of the Bioware equation is combat, and so of course when you're traversing the world or when you're in the midst of a quest, if you're not, tackling some sort of long dialogue with choice options or what have you, you're going to be in combat. And the combat is going, for a lot of people, it's going to be very reminiscent of Witcher 3. In fact, there's a lot of things that they borrowed from Witcher 3 that are going to be very apparent to anyone who's played Witcher 3 and then picks up this game. For example, in Witcher 3, you have 3 basic skill trees. You've got alchemy, combat, and magic. And those are the 3 basic skill trees you have in this game as well. You have alchemy, swords, and magic. Now, inside of your alchemy tree is the firearms skill, right? So that obviously is different from Witcher 3, but the alchemy skill is going to include things, again, reminiscent of Witcher 3, like applying oils to your weapons. You will get a bestiary in the game, sort of thing. I forget what it's called. But basically, it's a compendium or appendix or something like that. And it tells you about, obviously the lore and different characters and factions, but it also lists all of the enemies and beasts in the game, and it'll tell you, much like Witcher 3, their specific weaknesses. So you can do 3 types of damage in the game. You can do magic damage, elemental damage, and poison damage. And of course, as you encounter new enemies and you fight them and you pick up notes and stuff about them, you'll be able to learn their weaknesses. And so if you're primarily sword based, you might start applying oils to your sword so that you're doing more damage. The alchemy skill includes not just oils and guns, but also bombs. So in the alchemy skill tree, you can start crafting bombs to throw at enemies mid-combat, which do obviously more damage than your shots do typically. And that, again, is very reminiscent of Witcher 3. You pick the different bombs and the different types of damage you want to do for the different enemy types. Again, you'll have alchemy, so you can buff yourself up by drinking a number of different potions before combat. Because here's the other thing, you're going to want to do it before. It's a little tough to drink potions in combat because it is more like a Dark Souls. The combat is slightly Souls-like in that dodging attacks is extremely important rather than trying to parry, especially against monsters and stuff like that. Parrying isn't always going to work for the big type monsters. It's also Souls-like in the sense that for many of the enemies in the game, if you get hit once or twice, that's pretty much it. Until you get a little bit further in the game. But there's always going to be enemies that you're going to find in the world that will take you out pretty quickly. Another ways in which it's like Souls-like games is that if you need to do anything in combat, like use an item or drink a potion, like a health potion for example, your character has to actually stop and do it. You don't just like press it in the menu and then you've got the meters all filled up. Your character has to stop, pull out the flask, and drink out of it. And some of the combat can be pretty quick and pretty frenetic, so you've got to be really careful when you do that. So much like Witcher 3, you're going to want to, if you can, prep by drinking potions beforehand. And you can drink a number of potions to buff up different stats and reduce taking different types of damage. Also, the basic combat is very much like Witcher. It's going to largely depend on dodging at the last second, rolling out of the way, parrying. It even has the skull icons like The Witcher, where you'll be exploring the open world and you'll see an enemy and it'll be like, yeah, you can fight them if you want to, but they're probably going to kill you, so maybe wait. So a lot of these elements go towards really... They were definitely like grabbed from The Witcher 3 and sort of put in, I think, because they realized people sort of liked elements of that game. Yes, the one thing that is majorly different from a Souls-like game or Witcher 3 is that there is no stamina management. So you don't have to worry about that. So you can dodge and roll around the arena till your heart's desire. And combat against monsters and wildlife type enemies is going to largely be dependent on rolling in, getting in an attack, and then much like Witcher 3, seeing if they're telegraphing attack and then trying to get out of the way before something happens. Now, I've heard, much like Witcher 3, that you can parry monsters' attacks. I think I did it a couple of times in the beginning, but it's kind of difficult to pull off, so I usually just dodge out of the way. So as you can see, like, there's a lot of different things going on here. The thing that's unlike Witcher is the magic. Magic is a lot more like a traditional RPG, where you're doing tons of damage through spells and stuff. Witcher 3 is usually more, a lot of the spells are more just like combat buffs, or will do damage, but you can't rely on them. Only you're going to have to go back and use your swords. But in this game, if you want to just never touch your sword skills and just do totally magic, you can do that. Similarly with the guns and bombs, if you want to just be completely a musketeer and do that and never touch your swords, you can play it that way. And then, of course, you can combine any number of those in any way that you want. So it's not aping The Witcher 3, but it is heavily influenced by it. And additionally, there is an enemy in the game. They're sort of one of the characteristics enemies of the game, and they're sort of very plot relevant. They're called the Nadag. Nadaig. And if you've ever played The Witcher 3, they visually look extremely similar to Leshens, those sort of ancient, weird forest creature things. They're bipedal, they have animal body parts, but they are wreathed in usually a giant skull on top, and armored with what looks like tree bark or roots. And these are sort of the guardians of the island of Tirfridi. And again, they're sort of plot relevant, and there's a lot going on with them. And you'll find them at various spots throughout the world, and sometimes you'll need to fight them to get past a certain area, or just to make an area safe so that you can go traverse through it without getting, pummeled by these things. And much like, again, Witcher 3, sometimes you'll get contracts to take them out. Through various, villages will put up a contract like, please get rid of this one in the forest. And, oh, I forgot, yeah, you can blow up monster nests as well, much like Witcher 3. So yeah, there's a lot of heavy influence. And fighting these monsters constitutes like the mini boss battles of the game. It is a little less like The Witcher because you don't have to kill too many of them. If you don't, you don't have to kill everyone in the world, and there's not too many contracts out on them, and they're not the focus of what you're supposed to be doing. But they exist, and they offer a pretty good challenge, and usually they're hiding excellent loot. So they are sort of the mini boss battles of the game. Fighting them is sort of highlights some of the issues with the combat system, because they added that Souls-like potion drinking mechanic into the game where you have to actually physically drink the potion, and because the enemies are a little, especially the Nadaig, they're very cheap. One of the issues is that they will basically unrelentingly attack you, and they never stop. And so if you've gotten hit and you manage to roll away, by the time you roll away, stand up and drink a potion to get your health back, they're already on your ass again. And even if you roll to the other side of the arena, many of them can clear the entire arena in one bound. They'll jump just from one side all the way over to you and just stomp you out again. And so you'll be stuck in this situation where you're constantly evading and healing, and you never get a chance to do any damage. And because they move so quickly, and they have area of effect attacks, and they can clear any distance on the arena, they become sometimes incredibly frustrating to fight. Where you never feel like you can get in any damage, no matter how far away you are from them, without having to take a ton of damage. And especially when you have to fight them by yourself, there's, I think, one or two you have to fight by yourself, and then they just totally focus on you. They can become a little bit easier if you have companions, because then they might start focusing their attacks on them. Another thing that sucks about them is it highlights that the combat's a little unrefined as well, beyond just the issues I already talked about, in that the hitbox, I don't think your hitbox changes size much when you're fighting them, but I think the hitbox for their weapon, because some of them have like a sledgehammer or something like that, or a spear, I think the hitbox for the weapon is ridiculous. I remember vividly seeing my character roll out of the way just in time before they hit the ground, but I took all the damage anyways, and this happens all the time. And so they're incredibly cheap to fight, and they're only really feasible to fight when you've just leveled up so far that you just, it doesn't, you can shrug off whatever damage, but of course the final boss behaves much like that, and so that's a pretty tough fight, especially when, I think the final boss was the first time I had died in 20 hours in the entire game, and so that should tell you, the difficulty curve of the final boss was frustrating. Because my character had just, my build had really come together, and I wasn't having as many issues, and then boom, all of a sudden. So, yeah, combat is a very, I'd say a more casual version of Witcher 3, but it is fun. You know what I mean? Again, the game is not supposed to be entirely based around combat, and I think the combat serves its purpose. I really liked Witcher 3 combat. I've never understood why people hate it so much, because no one has really articulated why. But I'm open to not really changing my mind, but at least understanding why people don't like it. And the only thing that I can think of that has sort of been articulated is that it kind of removes a lot of the challenge and strategy from something like Dark Souls, while implementing a lot of the similar kind of mechanics. Because stamina management isn't very difficult in Witcher 3. You can just continually roll around and stuff. And some people think that that's what makes it terrible. But I sort of liked that because Dark Souls, while I think is a good game and I'd love to get into it, I just don't have the time to really practice and put in to get good enough at it to actually make progress. So I liked that Witcher 3 offered me at least a healthy challenge while also being able to progress in the game. And Greedfall taking out the stamina management, I mean, I think there's enough other stuff going on in combat to sort of make up for it. And again, it's a middle market game. It's not going to have that same level of AAA polish on it to be like, okay, now we need to kind of add some more nuance to the combat. But I think it's functional for what it is, you know. There's a lot of, knowing when to get in close, knowing when to evade. Playing to your strengths, too, is incredibly important. If you've been investing a lot in guns, I wouldn't use your sword very much because you're gonna get pummeled, Or if you don't have very strong armor, make sure you're using things like there's a stasis spell that will freeze enemies for a couple of hits and things like that. You need to use those. Keep an eye on your enemy's weaknesses, stuff like that. So you really need to look at all of the systems in combat. And then there's actually quite a lot going on there, because like when you're fighting human enemies, you have a move where you can kick them and throw them off balance. And if they're off balance, sometimes they'll fall over, or sometimes it's just harder for them to start their next swing. You can stun them depending on how hard you hit them, especially with bombs and guns. It's a great way to stun an enemy, and then you can get a couple of free hits in. You can parry, much like in other games, and you parry and then you get a free hit in after that. So there's a lot going on with the combat system. So in any given encounter, you're thinking about oils on your blade, bombs, when to, like sometimes if you're not a complete musketeer build, you might want to use your pistol tactically. So you might get in close, get a couple of things in. Maybe they'll land a blow on you that you don't quite block in time, or they throw you off balance with a kick, so then you might want to roll away, and if they're maybe at like 3/4 health, then get in like a pistol shot to either stagger them or whatever, and then come in for the kill. In addition to magic, maybe you want to shield yourself with some magic or heal instantaneously, or maybe you want to send out like an area effect attack. There was one attack that I had that was great. It was, so there's two things. There's an attack called Bomb, which is a special ability, and then there's actual bombs. And the bomb attack, your character throws this bomb in the sky and shoots it, and it does splash damage to everyone, and then all of these vials of poison start raining down over the entire battlefield, and then it starts doing poison damage to everyone. Now you have to charge that up, because that's another thing you got to think about. There's Fury Generation, which is kind of like your ultimate move or whatever, and you can use it in one of two ways. You can either use an ultimate attack, or you can do a normal attack that has a little more oomph behind it with full fury. So it's a decision that you want to make, and you can use those tactically as well. And the thing to think about in that situation is if you use the lighter attack, the normal attack, it doesn't consume your entire fury bar. So maybe you get in a couple of nice hits to deal with the enemy that's right in front of you, and then you build up some fury again to take out the big bad dude that's at the other end of the battlefield. So again, there's enough complexity in it to make it interesting, to vary your combat style mid-play, to be able to play to your strengths of your build, but it's not going to be as hardcore as something like Dark Souls, which also works because, like I said, some of the enemies can be a little bit cheap sometimes and try and stun lock you and do this, that, or the other thing. So you want it to be forgiving and simple enough so that some of the game's weaknesses don't start to bleed through even more. But I really liked the combat. I thought it was very fun. And oh, and here's the other thing too. I mean, it's not just like swords, guns, magic. Even inside of swords, you have your one-handed blades, you have your two-handed blades. with pistols, you can either go for like just heavy firepower that does like a ton of damage, or you can go for, they have like sort of repeaters. They have tri-barreled pistols, they have quad-barreled pistols, they have 5-barreled pistols, they have a revolver in the late game. And so if rate of fire is more important to you, or maybe you want to do tons of stun damage, maybe your gun doesn't do that much damage, but it stuns enemies for a long period of time, so then you can go so you can really play with the stats of all your weapons too to decide what's more important to you. You know, same thing with swords and whatever. Maybe it does more stun damage, maybe it does tons of armor damage but not enough traditional damage. Maybe it has additional bleeding or poison, or so there's lots of customization to be had in the game. There's one-handed heavy weapons, there's two-handed heavy weapons, so and that'll play into your, so you have skills, skills, attributes, and talents, and you're also going to want to pick skills in a playstyle that is based on your attributes. But going back to the combat real quick, so you have your skills, and you have your attributes, and you have your talents. Talents are the rarest skill in the game. You only get them every 4 or 5 levels or so, a single point to put in your talent tree. And talent will be something like lockpicking, or science, or speech, or crafting, or intuition. Now, intuition helps you spot things in the environment that you normally couldn't, and it's how you get through tight passages. Crafting is where you don't need to go to smiths anymore to upgrade your weapons, and I think things that you would normally need a crafting bench for, like potions and ammo and stuff, you can just craft in the field, so that's kind of a useful skill. Lockpicking speaks for itself, but there's a lot of really great loot in the game that's barred behind lockpicking. So if you're just like, well, I don't really care about lockpicking, then you're going to get through the game and be like, well, I don't have any of this good stuff yet. So even though you may want to spend those talent points elsewhere, it might be important to put a few into lockpicking. In addition to that, you've got the science skill. Now, the science skill gives you the ability to craft certain items, regardless of whether you have a table or not. So you can be good at crafting, but if you don't have a high science skill, you can't craft certain things. So, like, you can't craft potions if you don't have, I think, science of 2. And if you're going to be a musketeer, I would, because there's not really a lot of ammo in the world, and the vendors don't sell enough. And most enemies are going to average 3 to 4 shots to take down. So if you want to be a musketeer or a pistolero in the game, you're going to need to invest in the science skill, because it's the only way you can craft your own ammo. Once you can craft your own ammo, then you can easily be walking around with 2,000 rounds at any one time. But until that point, I remember seldomly using my pistol, or very carefully and tactically using my pistol in the early game, even though I was going for a musket build, because I hadn't leveled up my science yet. And I couldn't craft my own ammo, so I was always walking around with, if I was lucky, like 20, 30 rounds. And then as soon as I got that skill, I went up to like 2,000. So the one thing I like about the progression is all the skills really like balance each other out and depend on each other too. So you got to really be thinking about what you want to do. And then of course there's a speechcraft talent as well. That's if you want to pass speech checks in the game, which are very important sometimes for getting the outcome that you want. Sometimes you can't avoid violent outcomes or unfavorable outcomes unless you level up your speech skill, or talent, I mean. So then the skills are just what you can do. It's things like, can you use one-handed weapons, and how much damage do you do with them? And in the beginning of the game, you have a basic dodge where you just kind of like sidle to the right, or jump to the left or jump to the right real quick. But then you get like a full-on roll if you upgrade, if you get that extra skill. The ability to use pistols is a skill. The ability to use two-handed weapons is a skill. The ability to use magic rings, the ability to use certain spells is a skill. So those you level up. Here's the thing. You have to keep in mind your attributes. Now, skills you get a skill point every level, right? And most skills cost 1 point. So you can get a lot of skills by the end of the game. But attributes you only get every 2 or 3 levels. And then, of course, talent every 4 or 5. So for your attributes, maybe you have the skill to use magic rings, right? But if you're not leveling up your mental power and mana, then you're not going to be a great mage. So you may not want to invest in that skill tree. Similarly, you may unlock the skill for two-handed weapons, but you need the strength attribute leveled pretty high to use any quality two-handed weapons or do any significant damage. You know, you may get the gun skill, but if you don't have a marksmanship attribute, you're not going to do, no matter how good the pistol is in the game, you're not going to do that much damage with it. So another thing I liked about the game is it locks you out of using certain equipment, and it reduces the overall efficacy of your weapons and your offensive capabilities if you're not careful about balancing your skills with your attributes. You know, so for example, you want to balance your gun skill and your bomb skill with your marksmanship attribute. You're going to want to balance your spells, picking up the skills to use certain spells with a high mental power and a high mana. You know, if you're a heavy guy, you're going to want to balance the skill for endurance, which also limits what kind of armor you can wear. You're going to want to increase your endurance and maybe your strength. You know. So that's how the progression system works. I really, really like it because you have to be very careful about how your build progresses. But one of the other things I always love in progression systems is that moment where it all clicks and your build finally comes together, and then you're like a force to be reckoned with. And that absolutely happens in this game. For example, I went with a sort of a musketeer build, and swordsman. And I remember I was really having a lot of trouble fighting. Like I could shoot enemies and I was doing okay damage, but I'd have to put like 6 or 7 shots into a single enemy for it to come down. And then I finally found a little bit better pistol, but also I finally started dumping a ton of points into my marksmanship attribute because I already had the gun skill. And then all of a sudden, you know, I was just leveling the battlefield. And it makes you realize that every play style is viable provided you kind of stick to the build. Now, there's no level cap in the game, so technically you could probably get all the skills in the game. But maybe not, because you only get so much XP for killing monsters. And yeah, you could go out and grind it forever if you wanted to. But that would take it would just be a nightmare doing all that. So, the game definitely opens up towards the end, especially if you're doing all the side quests. Like, you have a lot of skill points, you have a lot of attribute points, you have almost all of the talents if you're playing smartly. But you're never really going to be at a point where you have every single ability or skill in the game, or every single attribute in the game. So, you do, for the predominant run of your playthrough, you are going to have to pick a build and stick with it. Another thing I love about the game, and this is going to sound a bit redundant to what Razorfist, I'm a big fan of Razorfist and his channel, what he said, and there's a good reason for it. It's a great, because there is no Solomon Kane video game, and this is like a great Solomon Kane simulator. You can wear the wide-brimmed hat with the dark cloak and go out with a rapier and a pistol and fuck shit up, and it's like really awesome. And I'm not aping what he said in his review necessarily, because I was having the same thoughts. I was inspired to get into Solomon Kane by Razorfist, absolutely. And it's because of I think it's Solomon Kane versus Comics video that he did that I picked up a copy of, I think it's the complete Solomon Kane works. It's the Savage Tales of Solomon Kane. And I started reading it. And then, of course, when I started playing Greedfall, I'm like, wait a minute, I can this is awesome. I can play as this guy. Then, of course, his review comes out and he says the same thing. But yeah, I just want you to know, if you are a fan, I guess of Razorfist, and he got you into that series, or if you are already a fan, this is the closest thing in a video game I can think of for you being able to play sort of like that character. And you know, with a little bit of a stretch of your imagination, roleplay as that character. So I really liked that. And back to builds, one of the things I loved about the builds in the game, beyond just, you know, getting to roleplay as like cool characters and stuff, is that, yeah, you will unlock some abilities or some weapons that might seem overpowered, but because of that moment where the game clicks you're going to be very satisfied with it. You know, you don't feel like, oh, well, the challenge is gone. You know, you're like, I remember how hard it was to get to this point and how much work I put in. So now I'm more than happy to have this OP ability or this OP weapon that just devastates, you know, because this is my build. I'm that guy. You know, I'm not the mage. I'm not the bastard sword wielder. I'm not the, you know, whatever. I'm the musketeer. I'm the pistolero, and I'm just gonna destroy with this gun, you know. So I really liked that. I love the variety of the armor, although I will say that a lot of the variety sort of dries up about 3/4 of the way through the game. 3/4 of the way through the game, you're going to have seen everything that's going to be available in all of the shops, and you'll probably have found most of the good pieces of armor on the map just through questing and stuff. So that was a little frustrating because, you know, for example, I finally got my marksmanship and I finally got my armor attribute up to maximum, and I was like, okay, what am I going to see in the shops now that this is all the way leveled up? And I wasn't seeing anything new, and that was a little disappointing. And there's no legendary firearms in the game either, so that's another sort of thing to keep in mind. Another awesome thing, just as an aside in the game, is that one of the legendary weapons is, if you see the logo for the channel, one of the things that's crossed underneath the skull in my logo is a kukri, which has always been one of my favorite knives. I just think it looks cool. I own a couple of them. I just think they're great knives. And in this game, one of the swords you can get, one of the short swords, is like a full length sword version of a kukri. And of course, as soon as I found that was just my go-to. In fact, I got even frustrated in the game when my character, because you have to have two, depending on your build, you have to have two weapons in two different slots. When he would immediately draw the other one, I would get frustrated and be like, no, I'd have to like go in and make him switch because I just loved using that weapon so much. So there's just like lots of, like, some of the armor is just so cool in this game, and it's unlike stuff you've seen in a normal fantasy RPG. So again, just this refreshing setting, refreshing set of aesthetics, refreshing weapons and armor and guns and everything like that was one of the things that sort of kept me engaged, and also seeing what else I was going to see in the world and where the plot would go, because the plot is rather engaging. So, you know, I love those elements of the game. In terms of travel and exploration, I liked that areas are clearable. Not permanently, though. So if you need to farm out some XP to level up or whatnot, you can do that. But if you're just exploring one map, you can kill everything on the map, and then if you need to do some further exploration, or you wanted to go check out that area again to see maybe what's in that treasure chest or whatnot, you can do that. Now, the enemies will respawn, except for the Nadeg, the little mini-bosses, the sort of Witcher 3 type monsters. Those do not respawn. So they are treated like sort of permanent boss battles. Once you fight them and you kill them, they're dead forever. Which I also like, because they are, some of them are frustrating enough to fight that you want that sense of accomplishment. Like, yes, I've cleared out this area from the real dangerous stuff. So a lot of the sort of ancillary wildlife or enemies, they'll respawn usually after about 24 hours, or if you travel and come back to the area. So it makes exploring large areas a bit more rewarding and easier. And I like that the environment is a lot more detailed than it appears on first glance. There's lots of hidden secrets, lots of hidden areas that you won't notice your first time through. So, you know, the careful observer is definitely rewarded, and that's how you're gonna find, like I said, some of the, like, that awesome kukri sword, or some of the like one of the best armors in the entire game, especially for my build, I found just out in the wild somewhere. I didn't have to do some crazy quest for it. So it's definitely something that favors, you know, the observant eye. One cool thing about exploring the environment is animals will have they have sleeping patterns based on day-night cycles. However, this highlights some sort of limitations and issues with the game. They have these sleeping patterns so that you can sneak up behind them and do a critical hit or a stealth kill on them. And it highlights two things. One is that there are a lot of stealth elements put into the game. There's a designated sneak button. There's stealth kills. There's even a potion that makes you relatively invisible that you can craft. But there's not really a way to play the game as a stealth build, because sooner or later during a quest, if you're trying to be stealthy or whatnot, you're going to get into combat, because like I said, the potion makes you mostly invisible, but not entirely. So you're going to have you're going to run into so many issues where the stealth's only going to get you so far, and then you just got to go in guns blazing. And again, there's no non-lethal option for the stealth either. So unless your build is just really, really terrible, or you have very, very weak armor, it doesn't really behoove you to do that. It just pads out the runtime of the game, and it seems to me a vestigial trait of what was probably a stealth system and possibly a stealth build in the game. So while there are good role-playing elements in the game for you to play to the build of your type and make the choices that you want to make without too much hand-holding from the story, there's a lot of missed opportunities like that. And so the vestigial stealth system in the game kind of highlights that. And also the sleeping cycles of the animals highlight that the people in the towns don't really have sleeping cycles, and they don't have day-night cycles. I think the most you'll see is there are just fewer people on the streets at night, but all the shops are still open and everyone's still awake that you need to talk to. So, yeah, it's one of the many things in the game that sort of highlights a lot of missed opportunities for more immersive elements in the game, and then of course more varied play. The world has excellent environmental storytelling by way of just its presentation, the different biomes of the world, the architecture. The architecture of a lot of the cities tells you a lot about what's going on. Things that you'll see strewn about, you'll see characters doing certain things, you'll see people engaging in certain activities. These all go in to help sort of make the world feel more believable, sort of lived in and real. And the architecture especially is impressive. There's a lot of tricks done to make the cities look and appear like much bigger than they are, and they're quite impressive to look at. Going up the steps of the cathedral and then turning around and like seeing San Mateus, or from the top of the steps of the palace in New Serene. Just the feeling of life and the attention to detail gives a lot of environmental storytelling to the world that got me more immersed and more interested in a game world that I already found very fascinating and interesting. And so it paints a world that's larger and deeper than what is immediately shown on screen. One of the things that I liked about the quests are that there, as I said before, a lot of the things that you're going to be doing are going to be locked behind your talents. Like I said, Vigor's a talent I forgot, which is the one that allows you to physically traverse obstacles. One of them is like jumping over these little man-made or these little natural log bridges. Another one is climbing up like very steep cliffs. So one thing that's nice is that there's not just multiple choices for how a quest is going to shake out due to dialogue options. Sometimes quests will have different outcomes if you sneak through them and try not to engage in combat. Sometimes quests will have different outcomes if you use the vigor talent to, I can remember one where you can try and fight through an entire barracks, or there's scaffolding up the side of the building, so you basically leave the quest, go outside of the building, climb up the scaffolding, and then you can go in through the window and just confront the one person without having to kill sort of the innocents who are just getting caught in the way. Lockpicking too, sometimes you'll have to go on a roundabout chase to find the key or whatever, but if you've invested in some lockpicking, you're good. Crafting, I remember one quest where I was going to have to go back and forth between this like holy area to constantly craft all these things, but I temporarily buffed my crafting talent and was able to just do it right then and there. So there's a lot of different multiple solutions. It's nothing earth-shattering or mind-breaking, but I just liked seeing it. I liked seeing this, like, okay, let me figure out the best way based on my build or how I want this quest to come out. Much like you would in a dialogue tree in Mass Effect, you know, to what are you going to say and how are you going to treat people to get the outcome that you want. There's also, you know, what are you going to physically do in this quest to, in this game at least, to change the outcome the way that you want. Speaking to that, when I was talking about the progression and the talents and things like that, one of the things that's also nice about the game is that, so you will never, I mean, I got to level 40, 41, something like that. And, you know, you're not going to get enough talent points to really round out your character to do all of the things that you could and probably should be doing that are locked behind talent skill checks. But cleverly, if you up your reputation with the people in your squad, then they will automatically give you bonuses to certain talents. So that's a way right then and there to, you know, save talent points on stuff that you really want, but still not be locked out of doing certain things in the game. In addition to that, different pieces of armor and equipment will give you buffs to talent skills. And you can actually upgrade them specifically to give you that. So there was a piece of armor I carried around, which was just as good as my other armor in case I needed to get into combat, but it gave me a +1 to lockpicking. So, you know, there's only 3 levels in lockpicking, so all I had to do was make sure I was leveled up to 2, and then I could unlock level 3 stuff wherever I went. I found these great gloves that gave me a +1 to crafting, so I didn't want to put any points into crafting, but there was a couple points in the story where I needed to craft stuff, and so I was able to do that. Your cape, you should never go anywhere without a cape in a game because it instantly gives you a +1 to charisma, which is your speech talent. So, you know, and I liked that. I liked that, you know, you can find, I always love that in RPGs where it's like, it's not just immediately based on the progression that you've chosen. It's also based on some of your equipment and maybe companions that you have or choices that you've made. So again, that's why I said earlier, like, you shouldn't be locked out of doing too many things that are based on talents, especially if you're playing smart. Load times in the game are relatively short, and another interesting inclusion that I like in this game for load times is that, because like I said, you don't physically travel from one point to another. You go to the edge of the map, and then it'll put you into a loading screen, and then after the loading screen, you will pop up in the next map that you want it to go to. So you don't actually travel the distance yourself. But in between the loading screens, you'll go to this like nether realm, which is supposed to be like a caravan on a forest trail. And it's where you and your team have made camp en route to wherever you're going. And one of the things I like about this system is it breaks up the monotony of long loading screens in a long form, like 40+ hour RPG like this, because what it allows you to do is, you know, because again, like any sort of Bioware RPG or like Mass Effect, you can't just take care of all the dialogue options with your companions at one time. Like, it's going to sort of slowly unfold throughout the story. So it's a great chance for you to go sit by the campfire with your companions and ask them what's going on with their lives, or ask them if they still need help with their personal quests, or what have you. In addition to that, there's a vendor there, so if you're starting to become overburdened, you can go sell a bunch of crap that you don't need, and then buy some things that you do. He also carries pretty good weapons and armor, so if you were in the market for a new pistol or a new sword or maybe some armor, you can pick it up there, you know, mid loading screen. And then of course there's a crafting table too, which allows you to, So if you need more health potions or more ammo before you go to the next area, you can do that. So I thought it was a great feature, and I used it a lot. I didn't think I was going to use it that much, but I always was, dropping off, selling stuff, selling all my swag at the vendor, and always crafting just a little bit of extra ammo, or maybe crafting some potions that I had been running dry on. So I thought that was a nice little feature that you don't see a lot. It's technically similar to, I guess, the Normandy in Mass Effect, where you always have this little hub place to do whatever you need to do. But I felt that this had, a little more immediate utility. The Normandy can make the game drag a bit if you're not totally into it in the moment. But this was sort of like a bite-sized version of that, so that it doesn't distract from the progression of the game too much. But it's better than just having like loading screens for like 30 seconds straight, because it'll be like a 5-second loading screen, then the campsite, then you do whatever, then maybe another 5-second loading screen, then there you go. You're to where you need to be. Exploration, as I said before, is relatively rewarded in terms of loot and experience. It's actually one of the best ways to level up quickly is just exploring. So even though I sort of said just stick to side quests, I'm still of two minds about it, because a lot of the exploration that I did in the redundant travel allowed me to engage in that much more combat in order to level up more quickly. So I guess I am of two minds about it. I will say this, though. A lot of the locations you discover while exploring are locations that are, as I said before, only relevant for quests. So you'll find this cool temple with all these vines growing over it and like this altar in the center, but you can't do anything. And it's only relevant once you come back for a quest. Additional, and so they're very lifeless places. And in addition to that, other than the villages that you're going to have to go to anyways for main quest points, there's very few things to be sort of found organically in the environment. There's very few places that are just like cool little, like with a little storytelling bit, like a dead body and like how did he get here and things like that. Or like, oh, you found this like cool ruin and there's some stuff to do in it. Or a village that's maybe not like quest important, but there's things to do and people to talk to in there. And actually that talking to people thing leads into the next thing I want to talk about. So I've said some very nice things about the game and some few criticisms, but it's by no means a perfect game. It's a game I really liked, and I think it's also reflective of the growing influence of the middle market industry. I think of all the IPs introduced in this console generation, I think Greedfall is probably one of the more interesting ones in terms of setting, lore, location, and originality. And that's what is also a little frustrating about it, is because it's a game I like so much, a lot of the limitations of the game, because it is a middle market title and because they went with this old school BioWare sort of structure to the game, is a little frustrating. I wish there were more immersive elements and activities in the game. For example, like you can go into a town, right? And this is something that has been becoming more and more of a problem that I've seen in the industry. Like this was very much a problem in Outer Worlds, which it shouldn't have been. That's a totally different type of game. But you walk into a town, and especially in Greedfall, there's the store. If you're lucky, there might be one other vendor. And I think as far as I know, I might be wrong about this, as far as I know, there's only one blacksmith in the whole game who can upgrade your gear or customize it for you. So there's not a blacksmith in every town, and there's not always two vendors in every town. Sometimes there's just one, right? And other than those people, and each town has the same setup too. So there's one or two vendors. There's a coin guard barracks, which always has the same structure, and there's always a dude inside that'll give you quests. And then there's the manor, the general manor, And then there's the docks as well. They all have docks, and they all have you can converse with the knots there. Not really converse. Sometimes there's quests for the knots there. The only person you can converse with in the knots, the faction, the nautical faction, is the admiral in New Serene. And then there will always be a large governor's house type building, which with again the same layout. Now it looks a little bit different inside depending on their culture, but it'll be the same layout. And it's a little frustrating that the only people in the game you can talk to are quest givers, and most of those people are usually just main quest givers too. They're not even side quest givers, right? Anyone you see walking around in the street, you can press talk when you're close to them, but they'll just spit out some one line. It doesn't even take you into like an actual conversation screen. They'll just be like, "Oh, hey, Leggett," or something like that. And so there's not much to explore in the towns other than just the visual feast, which is something. And then so there's some locked chests hidden around and some little secret areas. But beyond that, I mean, once you find those, you're just going to be running straight back and forth to like the governor's mansion to get a new quest, and then back, and then wherever. And so much of the city seems basically it's just set dressing. It's pointless, and you can't go inside different houses and check things out. And the only time you'll be going into special buildings is as part of quests. There's never just sort of this idea of like freely exploring. The taverns are always in the coin guard barracks. There's never like a tavern that's just its own thing. They're always in the barracks, and there's never anything to do in them. Like, you can't get drunk with your friends. You can't buy food and eat. You can't sit down and listen to some music. You can't gamble, and I think this game really lends itself to having more immersive elements like that. Like, I would have liked to have to eat for survival, or at least be able to eat for some stat buffs. I would have liked to have had to get stat buffs for sleeping. I would have liked to have had activities to do in each city, like explore and go in people's houses and steal their shit and possibly get in trouble. That's another thing. You don't get in trouble for stealing or sneaking around or anything like that. The only place where they don't let you go without a disguise in the entire game, outside of missions, is the Knots warehouses where they keep all the cargo and stuff. And as long as you put on a sailor's uniform, you're good to go. You can just walk in there and do whatever you want. And people won't care if you steal right in front of them. You can empty all the chests. I emptied a captain of the Coin Guard's chest right in front of her in her room. I even had to lockpick it to open it, and she didn't say anything. So, while there's this really well-told story and this beautiful, fascinating world and some nuanced combat and lots of stuff to see and explore, there's not a lot to do outside of the story quests or even the side quests. There's no activity to the world. There's no immersive elements to the world. I liked games like Kingdom Come Deliverance, where you could go gamble, you could get something to eat, you could get drunk. And if you got drunk, you'd have to wake up the next day hungover and deal with it, and maybe brew like a hangover potion, or just suck it up. If you ate too much, you had to deal with it. Yeah, you could go have a bath if you were filthy. You could go shag or wench if you whatever. And you could, you had to sleep every night, or if you could, you had to get your armor repaired and things like that. And there was always stuff to do at the taverns, and you could get into, fist fights with people, and there was music to listen to, and you could rent rooms at places, and as I said, gamble, and you could break into every single person's house in the city and steal everything that they owned, and if you got caught, you were in big trouble and you go to jail, or you had to fight the guards. I liked all of this stuff. Or in Red Dead Redemption 2, you've been on the trail for like 2 weeks, and you're just, your clothes are beat up and you're covered in blood and whatever, God knows what else, and you're exhausted, and maybe he's even getting gaunt because you haven't been feeding Arthur that much. So you saunter into Saint Denis, and you got money because you've been robbing lots of people. So you go to the fanciest hotel in town. You get your clothes washed. You have a bath. You shag a wench. Although I still don't think you can do that in the game, which sucks. You sit and play cards till the sun comes up. You make sure you get good and liquored up on whiskey, and then you have like a big old prime rib dinner. And then you crash till morning. or till afternoon, whatever, and you get up and then you saunter down the street and maybe you get your gun cleaned and then you get new sights put on it because you got some money and you want to get sort of re-outfitted to go on the trail. You go to the general store, you buy some food for your horse and some more hardtack or whatever the hell you eat out there. And then you go and maybe you get some new clothes, new hat or something like that, maybe new boots. And then you go and you get a shave, and it's like there's stuff to do in the cities. And you can go inside certain houses and certain buildings, and there's extra quests and, you know, all these, and it really feels like you're resting and relaxing your character, and there's stuff to do when you go into these towns, and there's stuff to explore and see and experience. You can go see a show. You know, you can go see a vaudeville show or a movie, you know, things like that. And I just feel like Greedfall, because the world is so interesting, really lends itself to that style more. Hell, even in Mass Effect, you can go do just stuff for fun. You can meet your crew at the bar and dance and get too drunk. And there's different rooms and places you can explore. But Outer Worlds, much like Greedfall, you know, or I guess other way around, Greedfall, much like Outer Worlds, the cities and villages feel very sterile, and they're only in service of continuing story missions and stuff like that. So I'd say if my one criticism, or the biggest criticism of the game, is that cities are impressively large but very superficial. I'd also like smaller touches. You know, one thing I was sad to see go away in the Far Cry franchise, like Far Cry 2 had dynamic weather, Far Cry 3 had dynamic weather. It was less frequent, but it would rainstorms would come through and things like that, and there'd be overcast days. Far Cry 4 should have been awesome for that, snowstorms and raininess and overcast in the Himalayas, but it never happened. You know, that's when they stopped, and now Far Cry 5 doesn't have that. It's like they're taking back features. This game has a beautiful day-night system because of the gorgeous lighting in the game. Sunsets and sunrises are just the best time to be around in that game and exploring. But I would like to see things too, like dynamic weather and stuff. I feel like a game like this lends itself to having those kind of features. I never tried it because I was playing a bit too much of a goody two-shoes in the game, but it doesn't seem that you can attack NPCs. And your choices in the story, up until I guess sort of the very end, are more moment to moment. You're not going to see like massive changes in the way that a city runs, or massive changes in the organizational structure of like a tribe, or massive changes to the environment based on your choices in the game. It's more going to be like moment to moment, like, oh, this person died and now they're not available for that next quest and stuff like that. And then that even that falls away, and it's really more like, okay, what sort of happens towards the end of the game is really influenced by choices. So even other, like, again, in terms of immersive elements, like, they did a really good job of including all of the armor, whatever armor set you have in the right cutscenes and everything like that. But for some reason, your weapons don't show up on your character model. The weird thing is, they do show up on some of them on your companions. So, you know, I loved my awesome kukri sword, and I never got to see it outside of combat. You know, I would have loved to see that hanging off my belt the whole game, or my big ass pistol or my giant blunderbuss that I crafted, or my big ass pistol, you know, sticking out of a sash. You know, I really wanted that sort of swashbuckling look, and you know, I didn't get that because you can't see your weapons on your character. So, you know, little things like that that help make the world, like, it's, I think, for a middle market title, for the first of its kind in its franchise, and for a studio that needed to have like a big success, which I think for them, this has been a pretty big success for what Spiders as a developer is typically used to. But I'm just worried that because I haven't played another Spiders RPG per se. I did play of Orcs and Men, but that was Spiders and Cyanide Studios. So I'm just a little concerned that because from what I understand, games like Technomancer, Mars Warlogs, and Bound by Flame, which are their other big RPGs that they've done are that Bioware style, and the Bioware style does not lend itself to a lot of sort of to worlds that are less superficial, with more stuff to explore, especially in cities and towns with more activities. Basically, I want more to do outside of quests, and I felt like in Greedfall that was a missed opportunity. And I don't think Greedfall necessarily needs to be open world, but I think making the game, the maps themselves on the game, a little more open and less stringently fixed on that old sort of Bioware design style would help level designers and developers to come up with more to do in the environment. I think that's sort of an antiquated design style that fit the technology of the time when Bioware was making like Knights of the Old Republic and stuff like that. But I think, Greedfall was such a cool world and such a great story, it really lends itself to being a world that you can get lost in, immersed in, and explore and have, and get sidetracked from side quests or the main quests by just doing this or investigating that, or just becoming a complete charlatan and stealing from everybody, Some additional things I forgot to mention, little issues I had with the game. I talked about the issue fighting certain enemies, that they sort of stun lock you. They have really short cooldowns. They can jump across the map, and it's very unfair fighting them. What I forgot to mention was, this is sort of a big problem. I had a lot of issues with this until my character got powerful enough, and then I could just charge into battle. But this was a big issue before, and it really pissed me off. I remember I almost got to the point where I wasn't liking the game in the beginning because of this. Let's say you go to fight an Adeg, right? And you've emptied all your ammo into him, and you've used like all your health potions, and now it's completely on your wits and on your sword, and you're just going in for like that last minute strike, and then just trying to avoid all of these crazy attacks, and then leaping around and stomping on you and area of effect, and you accidentally roll close to the edge of his arena. Well, it'll count that as you having left the battle area, and the Nadeg will de-aggro you and walk away. And so you say, okay, don't walk away from me. So you go back to him, and now, let's say he was at 25% health, and you're like, okay, I think I can do this. Now you've wasted all your ammo, all your healing items, and he's back up to full health and full armor. So, this was extremely frustrating. Anytime you get a certain distance away from an enemy or outside of their predetermined combat zone, they will instantly get full health back. Which, like I said, once you get to about the halfway point, it's not an issue. The game's easy enough. At that point, it doesn't matter. You should be in the combat arena the whole time. But the first several times I fought larger enemies, even enemies, just normal wildlife enemies out in the world, I would kind of retreat a little bit to get away from them, to give myself a chance to heal, and then by the time I get back to them, they'd be back at full health. So this is absolute horseshit, and it really pissed me off in the beginning of the game. And it adds to some of the cheapness of those, especially those boss fights. So that's another sort of issue the game has. Another issue I have is that because it's, that sort of Bioware, like, dialogue and story heavy style game and style RPG, one of the things that you'll notice in the beginning of the game is they'll have you run all the way across the city to do something right. And then they'll be like, oh, we have to go back to the mansion where the quest started. We have to go to back to the mansion of, Lestrade or whatever the guy's name is. And so, what it'll do is just automatically teleport you back there. So you've done all the quest objectives, it'll just automatically teleport you back there, and you're already mid-conversation with the guy who gave you the quest, right? Brilliant. Great. Okay? I don't need to traverse through the entire city again just to go back to do that. So a lot of the main story mission quests will be like this from time to time. They'll use very smart use of teleporting the character in order to avoid redundant travel. However, it seems that there must have been either a lack of oversight on some of this or two separate teams working on quests. You know, because another team, you'll have quests where you are running back and forth. Like, I remember one quest, I had to go to San Mateus, then I had to go to this village and talk to the head elder, then I had to go back to San Mateus and report what I found, then I had to go back to a different village and talk to them. Just one line of dialogue, and they're just like, yeah, I ate the burger. And then I go back and I'm like, yeah, she said she ate the burger. Oh, well, find out who ate my tacos. And then I go to another village, and it was just like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And this doesn't happen like one time. Especially towards the end of the game, there's several quests where it's like it just never stops. Like, it's just back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. And you're not doing enough when you get to the place. It's not like you have to sneak into a fortress and kill a bunch of dudes, or like steal something from someone, or like confront somebody and you know, learn some horrible truth. It's like you just go to say one thing to somebody, and then it's just all the way back across the map. And it's just back and forth through the loading screens and the little campsite area. And it was frustrating because it seemed, like I said from the beginning of the game, that they had realized that this is horseshit, and that, oh, let's just teleport the character where they need to be if they just need to carry on a conversation. Or let's just engineer the quest so that there's less, like, one line of dialogue to some person on the other side of the world. And I got a sense of that at the beginning of the game, but then through a lot of the side quests, and then through a lot of the quests leading up to the end of the game, I really was under the impression that there was a totally different team managing those, and it was very frustrating. So it didn't ruin the experience for me at all, but it just made certain parts of the story get boring and tedious, and I was just like, this is not, like, I was excited to pick this game up whenever I wanted to, you know, whenever I had time. I was excited, but then, you know, a couple hours in, I'm starting to get bored, and I'm like, God, it's just like back and forth through loading screens. And so that was another thing I was extremely frustrated with at some points in the game. Keep in mind, not the whole game is like that. And like I said, there are plenty of quests that do the smart thing of just teleporting you. But that just wasn't consistent throughout the game. So that was my sort of explanation and introduction into the gameplay, into what you can expect, the positives of the games, the drawbacks of the game. And so if I had to give my overall impression of the game, when I bought the game, I was absolutely fascinated and interested with the setting and the world, and in finding out about the lore of the game. And I purchased it because what I wanted was, especially after being very disappointed and bored by Outer Worlds, I wanted a game with an interesting story, with a fresh, some fresh ideas that I hadn't really seen before, especially in that kind of game. And I wanted something I could really sink my teeth into, you know. And I definitely feel that this is a game that just met all of those hopes for what it would be. I really loved the setting. I loved the characters. I loved the plot. I loved the combat in the game. I loved exploring the world. I loved the visuals. I loved just the fact that it was a fantasy RPG in a setting that is very non-traditional for fantasy RPGs. Another thing I liked is that there's no real bad guy to the game. Everybody can be sympathetic from here and there, and everybody has two sides to them. Another thing that I really liked about the game was, in many games it can be hard to figure out who to trust, who's going to make the right choice, or who's going to push the story in the way that you want them to push the story. But the thing I liked about this game is you don't get to know people by them just telling you what they're about. They're like, oh, well, you know, I like giraffes, and I'd like to populate this area with giraffes, you know, and you're like, okay. And then you side with them on a quest, and then they populate it with elephants instead, and you're like, that's not what I wanted. Like, how could I have known, and blah, blah, blah. In this game, people will still, you know, lie to you, and people will be deceitful, but the problem is this game gives you, what I really like is, if you're paying attention it gives you an opportunity to observe their actions as well. It's not just what they say in dialogue, it's their actions. And so based on the actions of a lot of characters, regardless of what they say to you about what their intentions are, you know, for example, there might be another guy in the tribe and he'll be like, I could go either way on giraffes, but if that's what you want. And then he starts like, you know, you see him starting to put in the order for giraffes and you're just like, okay, that guy wasn't totally on board with me, but he's already started to act in a way where I think I'm going to get the outcome that I want. I'm going to get the giraffes in the field that I want, you know? So one thing that I really liked about the game is you can anticipate people's behavior based on their actions and give them the according support or the proper support or trust accordingly. So that made it a lot easier for me to get really involved in the story and feel like I could push it in the direction that I wanted based on my choices and who I trusted and who I supported and things like that. So, and then of course the people that I ended up not supporting or having my doubts about ended up disappointing me, you know, predictably though, which is why I didn't like either choose them or side with them or support them or save them. So I really liked that. And so it was a game that was it was just a fun, refreshing experience. It's flawed in many ways, true. But I think it shows that the middle market is where the real ideas are coming from. The middle market is where the innovation is happening. Maybe not always like in terms of this game like gameplay, but at least in story and settings and at least just developing new IPs, you know, and not just rehashing the same shit over and over and over again with, you know, the same IPs, but really trying to create something new. And so for the novelty of it, for, you know, the beautiful world, for the story, for the type of character I could play, for the type of combat I could engage in, and that I said before, you know, it's a game I just let myself get lost in. You know, a lot of games I'll get antsy because I don't always have a ton of free time, and I'll get antsy and I'll say like, you know, this game needs to wrap up now, like, and I'll go online and I'll check the walkthrough and I'll say like, okay, how far am I from the end? You know, I really, really need to know. Oh, I've got this many quests. This is a game that I never was tempted to do that. I was totally fine. And in fact, I was really upset when the game ended. I was sad. It was like finishing a good book. I'm like, oh, what the hell am I going to do with myself now? You know, it's also a game I would say take your time with. You know, it's not a super fast-paced action, balls to the wall, in your face, you know, guilty pleasure, you know, sensory overload, fun type thing. It definitely is a little bit slower paced, and it definitely, you know, is going to take some time. So, you know, don't try and cram it in over a weekend, because I don't think you're going to really enjoy yourself. And I think you're probably going to, some of the nagging issues of the game are really going to get to you. I would say, you know, like I started this, I think Thanksgiving weekend, and I just finished it around Christmas. So it took me about a month, and I really loved the experience and I enjoyed it. And I'm actually looking forward to finishing all the achievements for the game and trying to beat it in extreme mode. The only thing I wish is that there was a new game plus mode, but there isn't. So, yeah, I think Spiders deserves praise. I think they deserve your support. If this game even remotely looks interesting to you, I would say go ahead and buy it and pick it up and enjoy it and take your time with it and sink your teeth into it. Don't try and rush it, you know. Other RPGs in the same vein, I've been very happy that I took my time. Like Vampire, I think I would have scratched my eyeballs out if I tried to run through. Vampire does have some redundancies, and it is a little bit long in the tooth. So if I hadn't taken breaks from it and played it more modestly, I don't think I would have had as many positive things to say about that game. As it is now, though, because I took my time with it, and when it got a little long in the tooth, I took some breaks from it. I remember it much more fondly. And so, yeah, the middle market games, they're going to stumble in areas. They've got some learning to do, but that was another game that I thought was, you know, it was a fresh IP. It was a fresh take on certain elements of being a vampire, and there was a lot of unique stuff going on in that game that kept me captivated. So this is a review of of the middle market as much as it's a review of Greedfall. And Greedfall was a great experience for me, and I hope that it's a great experience for you. And I hope if you were curious about the game, I hope I've been able to shed some light on it, and hopefully, instill a few converts to go get it who are maybe on the fence. Well, that's all I have to say about Greedfall. Let me know in the comments what your experience with the game was. If you have any agreements or disagreements about it, I'd love to hear. I'd also love if anyone can tell me like what everyone hates about The Witcher 3 combat. Like, articulate it. That's the issue I'm having, is that I know that a lot of people don't like it. I'm not disputing that. I'm not even saying that they're wrong or that I'm right or anything like that. I just haven't gotten any sort of specific complaints to help me empathize or sympathize and say like, oh, okay, I see that point of view. I may disagree, but I at least see where you're coming from. That makes sense. So if anyone knows, please let me know. With that, I hope to have some other reviews out soon. The next one on the list is Outer Worlds, I would say. And the funny thing about Outer Worlds is I'm going to be saying a lot of the same things about Outer Worlds that I said about this game, but in a much less favorable light, and it's going to be, unfortunately, it feels like a bit of mental gymnastics to try and rationalize why I didn't like Outer Worlds very much, but I liked this game. Off the top of my head, I think it's going to come down to originality. I think Outer Worlds was really lacking in originality, and also a cohesive aesthetic, narratively, visually, everything like that, that just kind of made it fall apart for me. But Outer Worlds makes a lot of the same mistakes that this game does, and it didn't bother me nearly as much in this game. So that'll be an interesting review to write. All right.